Something pretty wild just happened in a state election down in South Australia, and it sent some serious shockwaves through the country's political world. And right at the center of explaining it all is one of Australia's most well-known conservative figures, Barnaby Joyce. He sees a rising orange wave for his party, One Nation. So what was the big shock? Well, it all comes down to this number. Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, which is known for its really strong conservative platform, pulled in over 20% of the primary vote. Now, a number like that for a minor party, it's almost unheard of, and it has absolutely shaken up the establishment. And this surge, well, people are calling it the orange wave, thanks to the party's signature color. So what exactly is this wave? And what in the world is driving such a major political shift? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down today. Here's how we're going to tackle it. First, we'll dive into the orange wave itself. Then, we'll look at the specific policies that are fueling it. We're also going to cover a pretty big controversy, check out the growing rivalry on the political right, and finally, ask what might be next for One Nation. All right, let's start at the beginning. Let's look at the election that kicked off this whole conversation. The impact it was huge. On top of that staggering 20% primary vote, the party locked in 2 seats in the state's lower house. And at the time this was all being reported, they were still in the running for 3 more. That's a serious foothold for a party that's often been seen as being on the political fringe. Now here is where Barnaby Joyce just completely flips the script. You see, usually minor parties like One Nation get accused of splitting the vote of the major conservative parties. But Joyce? He argues the exact opposite. He's claiming that One Nation represents the true conservatives, and it's the mainstream Liberal Party that's actually splitting their vote. That is a really bold way to reframe the debate. Okay, so what is it that's attracting so many voters? If you ask Barnaby Joyce, the answer is pretty simple. It's all in their policies. The party's whole pitch is basically one of unapologetic conservatism. Joyce describes it as having clarity, unity, and strength. And he's very clear. They are not chasing what people call the sensible center. They're not trying to win over moderate voters. They have their beliefs and they are sticking to them, plain and simple. So, take a look at their economic and energy policies. They're advocating for new coal-fired power stations and want to get rid of what Joyce calls the climate bogus industry. This is a direct challenge to the political consensus and a direct appeal to voters who are worried about high energy prices and the loss of traditional jobs. And on the cultural side of things, they're really focused on promoting a single Australian culture, not multiculturalism. They talk about having guardrails and clear expectations for how people should behave. They're also pushing for a tax system that's designed to help families where one parent can stay at home, which really taps into a more traditional view of society. But when you have such a strong, uncompromising stance, it can often lead to some major controversy. And that brings us right to our next section, which is all about a very heated debate over some comments Joyce made about immigration. This is the direct quote that sparked a huge firestorm. Joyce was talking about immigration policy, and he used this analogy of buying cattle, basically saying that if immigrants from a certain place cause problems, you should just stop accepting them from there. The backlash was immediate and fierce. The core criticism? That the analogy was totally dehumanizing because it directly compared people to livestock. Joyce, however, he doubled down and defended his words. He argued the analogy wasn't about faith or race, but was actually about practical risk assessment. He was trying to say that if immigrants from a specific country of origin are consistently causing issues, it's just common sense not to keep accepting more from that same source. And this whole controversy, it really just feeds into a much bigger battle that's happening on the conservative side of politics. We're talking about a growing and very public rivalry between One Nation and the mainstream Liberal Party. You can see this tension playing out right in the open. A Liberal senator warned voters that supporting One Nation would just hand a victory to the opposition Labour Party. And Joyce? He fired right back, accusing the mainstream conservative coalition of pure arrogance and of being totally out of touch with its own voters. So, with all this momentum and this pretty intense rivalry brewing, what's next for One Nation? Where does this orange wave actually go from here? Well, according to Joyce, the party is professionalizing. He's talking about massive growth in membership and, maybe more importantly, in the skill sets of the people joining. They're actively trying to recruit what he calls top-shelf candidates, people like a former CEO of major agricultural companies, to build up their competence and credibility and to fight back against being labeled as racist or bigots. And that brings us to our final question. Joyce himself describes One Nation's whole strategy as making emphatic statements of the bleeding obvious. So as the party gets bigger and aims for more power, will that unapologetic, controversial, and super direct approach keep growing the orange wave? Or will it be the very thing that limits how far they can go? That, right there, is the central question for the future of Australian politics.